Emma and Tom Talk Teaching, a podcast about all things education, presented by Emma Thayer and Tom Breeze. Episode 19, Best Practice for Educational Transitions with Dr. Rhiannon Packer.
A warm welcome back to the podcast, everyone. Welcome back to Emma and Tom Talk Teaching. We are joined by a guest who is a previous guest and a friend of the podcast, who you will have heard if you listened to our episode in January of 2021, speaking about her research that she does and has done in tandem with Dr. Susan Davis on supporting quiet, shy and anxious children. But we've asked her to return to us today to talk about a really important research topic to her and her work. So without further ado, talking about transition today, I would like to welcome back Dr. Rhiannon Packer. Welcome back, Rhiannon.
Thank you, Emma, and Tom. It's lovely to be here.
And it seems that January was quite a significant month for you because obviously you featured on our podcast, first and foremost.
Yeah, at first, yes, and I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
It was great to have you. But more importantly, am I right in saying that this was your first book publication in January?
Yes, first whole book publication with a number of former colleagues from University of South Wales, and the book was published, I think, 14th of January this year, so we were really excited about that.
Well, congratulations. And it's actually what that book deals with, which is entitled All Change, ! Best Practice for Educational Transitions. And just to kind of steal from a bit of the blurb, it says it examines transitions within education between year groups, key stages and schools, and how they can be managed and supported for the maximum benefit of the pupil. So I think first things first, just to remind our listeners, if they haven't listened to that episode back in January, could you just tell us about what you do, what your role is at Cardiff Met? Because you're a colleague here. So what's your role here?
I'm a senior lecturer in additional learning needs, and I teach on both the undergraduate and master's programmes at Cardiff Met. So I teach on a number of additional learning needs modules for the Education, Psychology and SEN programme, and I'm also the pathway leader for the master's additional learning needs programme.
Well, we're here to talk about transition today, and I remember transition being a really hot potato at one stage, but it's almost kind of, I don't know, it's sort of disappeared again a little bit in the consciousness while we've all got terribly excited about curriculum reform and things like that. So let's just remind ourselves what we actually mean by transition in an educational context, and particularly for anyone who's not listening in the UK, what are those key transition moments in education where we really need to get things right?
I think transition in education is simply when a child or young person moves to the next step or stage in their educational journey. So initially it will begin with the transition from home to a preschool or early years setting, and then potentially comes to an end when someone finishes their compulsory schooling. But of course, there are many points in our life when we experience transition. So in terms of education, the key points of transition, which have attracted a lot of attention by academics and researchers, is that initial transition from home or preschool to formal schooling, then from ages 10 to 11, so when someone moves from primary school to secondary school here in Britain. And these are considered the key transition points. But as practitioners know, there are other transition steps in the learner journey between key stages in particular, which can have an impact upon the individual. And that's something that with the new reforms, Donaldson has been quite aware of what impact that transition can have, and has tried to mitigate that by reducing the number of transition points during that educational journey.
Really interesting. But I mean, on a personal level, I'd really keen to know where your research interest and interest of practice around this stemmed, and which aspects you were most keen to understand more deeply. What was missing from the information and knowledge out there?
So I think the initial interest came from a discussion with colleagues at the University of South Wales, where I used to work. A group of us had already contributed to a book about teaching early years, and we'd enjoyed working together, and so wanted to do something else together. So we all came together to have a chat about what we could look at and what our interests were. And discussions like this are always good to have over lunch. It's good to have some food and some good coffee and tea, etc. So we'd been discussing the learner journey together. I think particularly we were talking at that point about how our students transition from year 1 to year 2, and how our expectations of them change, but do we actually explain to them what those expectations are? So we were talking around that, and then I think we thought about transition as a whole and that transition journey, and then looked at, there was about 4 of us in the room, and we discussed our own experiences of transition and also our experiences as teachers, and realised that we came from a wide variety of backgrounds. So Amanda, for example, she'd worked in an early years setting, she'd also worked in FE and now was working in HE. Philippa Watkins, she'd worked in a secondary school and had experience at FE, I think. And then Kath Jones and I also had been working in secondary schools and HE. So it sort of began from there, really. We were thinking about the different experiences we'd had as practitioners, then as learners, and then also some of us are parents, and we're talking about the experiences that we had of transition in terms of being parents of children who were going through the same process. And I think what we thought, and when we'd done some reading around the topic area, was that you don't always hear the voices of those involved in that transition process to see what they had to say about it. So when we looked at the research, sometimes you heard the voice of pupils around transition, sometimes you heard the voice of practitioners, but very rarely did you hear the voice of parents, and I don't think we've ever seen any research that actually brought all those voices together. And I think that's what we wanted to do, to provide an opportunity for people to give voice to those experiences, and then for us to draw it together to find out what that best practice is.
So if we kind of drill down now into the realities of transition, I suppose on the surface, when you describe what it is, they move from one context to another, one key stage to another. It sounds like a really simple thing. And yet, you've written extensively about transition. You've got your book, you've got journal articles, more accessibly, you've written on the BESA blog, you've written in The Conversation. The word that keeps coming up when you talk about it is complex. So what is it about transition that makes it such a kind of complex, knotty thing for us as education professionals to get right, and in terms of the experience as it's seen by those young people themselves?
I think it's complex because it can affect an individual in many different ways. So in a lot of the writing that I've done, I compare transition to crossing a bridge, and I've taken that, I can't remember, from Galton and McClellan, I think, and they refer to transition as crossing a bridge. And you can cross a bridge in a number of different ways, and there can be lots of potholes in the bridge which you can either fall into or you can circumnavigate. And I think we ought to look at learners in the same way. So for some learners, that prospect of moving up a class or moving into a new school, or going from primary school to secondary school, is a very exciting prospect, and they feel well supported and are able to deal with that change very easily. A lot of us are quite resistant to change. We don't like change, as the current pandemic has shown us, and preparing learners for that change is also very important. And learners need to know what's going to come, how it might affect them and how they can be prepared for it. For some learners, it's not a challenge, and for others, they may need more direction and more support in order to navigate that crossing from one setting to the next setting. And it's also not about a change in the environment. Transition can mean a change in personnel, new teachers, new peers, and also in terms of the expectations, both academic ones and social ones. And these can all have quite a profound effect upon the individual if we're not aware as practitioners of those potential issues or pitfalls.
It might be nice just to unpick this a little bit more, to home in on a kind of key point of transition that you mentioned a little earlier on, that is one that is particularly important to our student teachers on the PGC primary and secondary programmes here at Cardiff Met, and indeed the BA primary student teachers as well. And it's that transition where pupils are moving from primary phase to the secondary phase, which for us in the UK takes place around sort of 10 or 11 years old. If we zoom in on that moment in time, can you tell us anything about what you've discovered about the way children experience or feel or perceive that very big transition?
Yes, our book discusses transition at a number of points in the education journey, but I would say that the transition which has the most impact on the learner is that transition, the transition from primary school, age 11, to secondary school. So when they're, around that age, 10, 11, 12. I think it's a profound change for most learners, well, maybe all learners, on a number of levels. So combined with that excitement is also trepidation, and is about managing both carefully. And I think it impacts, firstly, socially. So they may move with some friends from their peer group, or they may not. They may be going to a completely different setting. So, and there also may be uncertainty as whether they will be in the same friendship group when they're moved into their new classes. So this can be a concern. Also emotionally, so going to secondary school is a rite of passage, and it's a move from being a child to becoming a teenager and moving on to becoming an adult, and that can be quite a big deal if you're not ready to accept that change. And yeah, while it's exciting, that can also be daunting. It's also demanding in terms of expectations. So academically, you're moving potentially from being taught mainly by one teacher in a small setting where you're in a smaller class and you know everybody quite well, to having a different teacher for each subject. And you need to navigate different teaching styles, different expectations within the class, different ways of organising. You also have a responsibility to organise yourself for the school day. And there's that move from being told what to do to more independent learning. So you're responsible for doing your homework on time, submitting your work on time, getting to class on time, etc. Also in terms of environments, I was speaking to my daughter who's just moved into secondary school, talking about the impact that has had upon her. And she said it was quite daunting moving into the new secondary school because it was so huge compared to the primary school. And she was worried about getting lost on her first few days there because she didn't really know where to go. And it was enormous compared to being in primary school. And also these children go from being top of the school, the oldest pupils in the class, to becoming again the youngest pupils and possibly the smallest. So yeah, it's quite daunting on a number of levels.
So for our student teachers and our kind of practicing teachers that listen to us, and we've got secondary, we've got primary, we've got people kind of at both ends of that really important point of transition. From your kind of experience, and I guess really importantly, having listened to the voice of the learners as well, because that's really important, what would be your kind of top things that teachers in these settings can do to make that transition as kind of, I suppose, non-traumatic as possible, to smooth that transition and make it as easy as possible? Because I know that from those of us in secondary, there's always this worry about a dip, while they get their heads around the transition, there's a bit of a dip. So even from that slightly mercenary point of view, I suppose, in terms of attainment, but also in terms of well-being, what can we do to smooth this transition?
Yeah, I think we need to be aware of the academic dip and to think about what might be the reasons behind it. So, as I mentioned, some of the key concerns when, we were looking at best practice. So we went to a number of schools where we knew transition was being done well and spoke to pupils, and they all came with the same concerns, which was around making new friends, being able to cope with the work and getting lost. So those were their main concerns. And I think the teacher role here is critical, because they are the agents of change in that whole process. So they begin that process of transition, and they control how that transition is managed. I mean, and usually it's, when we were discussing with teachers, it was about working collaboratively, both primary and secondary schools working collaboratively together in ensuring that transition was a smooth one. And I think after that, it's important to reflect upon the process, so to review and amend as necessary. So, for example, when I was interviewing a group of Year 7 pupils with additional learning needs about their transition process, one of them had mentioned that the handbook that they'd been given about coming to the new school was really helpful, but they couldn't understand the map because the school is situated on a number of levels and has a number of floors for the buildings. They couldn't clearly see whether they should be on the first floor or the second floor from the map. They had difficulty reading the map, and was suggesting that maybe the school provided another map, which was maybe a more 3D map or a more visual map, so that they could follow it. So when I fed that back to the head of year, because he was very keen to hear what his pupils were saying about the transition process, that was something he thought then that he could build in to the handbook or to, part of the transition events that he was organising. So I think it's really important that teachers are aware of maybe the impact that transition can have on pupils, and also to listen to them in order to make that transition process smoother for incoming pupils, and to realise, what maybe worked a few years ago might not necessarily work today. So you need to be responsive to that feedback and amend as necessary.
And I'm going to just divert a little bit from the pre-released questions that we gave you here, Rhiannon, not to kind of throw you off, but I was really fascinated by what you said about the fact that the parent or carer voice was really sort of missing or wasn't positioned in relation to what the teachers and the pupils were saying. So what role did the parents and carers play in this process, and how can schools work with them to make this transition point, or transition more generally, more smooth?
I think from the feedback we had from parents, it was that in the primary school they felt very much involved with what was happening, and that I think maybe because you tend to pick your children up from primary school, you're on the doorstep, so to speak, and you can just walk in, you see the teachers at the gate and you can have a conversation with them. And the concern was when their child went to secondary school that they were maybe held more at arm's length. And I'm not saying that happened, but I think that was a concern, that they maybe didn't have as easy access to teachers as they had previously in the primary school, and maybe that their involvement wasn't seen as important as it was perhaps in the primary school. And I think part of that is natural. That has to happen, doesn't it? Because you're trying to encourage your children to become independent adults, but that letting go sometimes can be difficult. Having said that, from the schools that we interviewed and spoke to, they'd put a number of measures in place to reassure parents. So, for example, one school had got a Twitter account that was designated for transition, where they put a lot of information about the new school on the Twitter account, information for parents in particular, that was a good way then for maintaining that contact between parents and the school.
Thinking about curriculum reform now here in Wales, I mean, one of the big headline things about the new curriculum is this attempt to kind of remove some of these hard milestones that we had in the past, you know, key stages, that kind of thing, a kind of acknowledgement that pupils are going to move at slightly different paces and that we should be perhaps a little bit more realistic about that. Having said that, of course, there's an awful lot of stuff in the melting pot at the moment. There's a lot of stuff changing. Are there opportunities here to make transition work better? I suppose conversely, is there a danger that transition as a priority gets lost in the noise while we're changing so many things? I mean, do you get a sense of how transition might look or could look or what the opportunities are there?
Yeah, I do agree with Donaldson in terms of limiting or minimising the number of transition points for learners and maybe smoothing that journey somewhat. But equally, we need to build resilient learners who are adaptable and who can accept change. So while it's in our nature to be resistant to change, we still, if we're prepared for change, we can accept it better. And I think what we need to do is to prepare our learners for change and to acknowledge what their concerns might be and to address them openly. I think, as I keep saying, we were looking at best practice. So in the schools that we were looking at, there was a lot of communication between the primary schools and the secondary school prior to that transition process. So, for example, we saw maybe year 5 going into the secondary school for an event that wasn't about transition, but provided an opportunity for the learners to be in that new environment, so that transition process is a gradual one and not a sudden one. Other examples are where there's some modelling perhaps of the new curriculum whereby there's one teacher teaching humanities rather than teaching history, RE and geography separately. So there's some continuation where the pupil sees the same teacher regularly and can build maybe a better relationship with them than they might do if they had them for separate or different teachers for separate subjects. So I think, we have to experience change and transition because that's part of life and we need to be prepared for it. But I think we ought to build that resilience in our learners by listening to them, by acknowledging what they might find difficult and trying to address that so that we've prepared them for that change.
So I've got to say, again, I'm diverting from the questions here, but I've wondered if I might probe your ideas and your thought process here about something that's gaining quite a bit of momentum in Wales, which is the idea of a through school or an all ages school setting. And I think I might be completely wrong on this, so people can call me out on it if they want to. I think there's about 20 of them in Wales. And you've got primary and secondary all on the same site, sometimes with sixth form as well. And I just wondered what your thoughts were on that in the context of transition, and if you had any sort of optimistic views on that, or if there were any potential problems with sort of maybe denying pupils the, dare I say it, the kind of baptism of fire aspect of transition. Not that we want it to be painful, but there are things in life that are quite challenging. So, yeah, long-winded way of saying, what are your thoughts about through schools, Rhiannon?
Yeah, I'm not sure, Emma. Yeah, I was thinking about that as I was preparing my answers for this interview, and I'm really not sure because, yeah, I agree with you. I think, we all experience adversity and challenging times in our lives. And, I think being prepared and being able to cope with challenge is really important. And we shouldn't make life too easy. If it's too easy, then we find it more challenging to cope with change. So I think I'm really not sure about through schools. On one level, I really like the idea, because I like the idea that the older pupils maybe can influence younger pupils, and you've got that idea of a continuum. But then I was speaking to somebody else, I can't remember who, but about that idea of a rite of passage, that, you know, by leaving your primary school, it's an exciting new start, and that if anything went wrong in the primary school, you've got an opportunity now to have a blank slate and start again. And there's that excitement of putting on a new uniform, getting on the bus perhaps for the first time to go to a new setting that is quite exciting and fresh. So yeah, I haven't got a straight answer, sorry.
No, I was just interested, and I guess it's very early days, isn't it? Because I'm not sure how long the newest of these through schools has been going, but they are becoming more of a common setting now in Wales. So I want to bring us back to the here and now. We're recording, it's the 25th of February, and there's been a lot in the news this week in particular about how we're going to, or how particularly the government in England is going to address what they're calling the kind of catch-up that children are going to need. And there's a lot of backlash actually from the teaching community about this narrative of catch-up, and also psychologists jumping on the bandwagon saying that this can put huge pressure on pupils. So I just wanted to get your thoughts, because you obviously wrote your article in The Conversation, which was kind of positioning your research about transition in the context of pupils returning to school after a long period of our first lockdown. So how might our understanding of how change affects children help us to navigate the months ahead as we come out of the COVID-19 pandemic?
I think that we need to be really mindful of what we've all been through, children as well as adults, and maybe adults are better at coping at it, but the social isolation of children has been quite profound, really. And, you know, I've got two children who are in the lower years of secondary school, and you know, they haven't seen their friends properly for a very long time. I think we need to consider well-being first, mental health and well-being, and children will catch up if they are engaged and ready to learn. And I think we need to make sure that when our children go back to school, that they have an opportunity to feel settled, to feel welcomed, to feel comfortable before we begin to expect them to learn. And so I'm not promoting the idea of extra lessons or using up summertime to go back to school. I think children need time to re-socialise, to meet up with their friends, and to get back on track. And once they've had that opportunity, I think then they'll be ready to learn. And, you know, when we're talking about catch-up, what are we catching up on? You know, I do really feel for those children undertaking exams and being in year 10 and 11. You know, it's a really difficult time, 12 and 13 as well. It's a really difficult time for them. But for the younger children, I think they need to reintegrate themselves back into the classroom, and then they're ready to learn.
And I suppose, Rhiannon, I mean, I almost feel bad asking you this, given you've just had a book published, and if I was you, I'd still be lying down in a darkened room probably. But have you got anything on the go at the moment? Have you got any research on the go, or anything you're writing up, or even just a sense of what you're interested in next?
Oh, you know me, Tom. Yeah, I've got a few projects on the go at the moment. So I've just had an article accepted for publication with one of my colleagues, Amanda Thomas, on transition for learners in FE, because that's an area we thought needed a bit more research. And I'm also working with a colleague in Cardiff Met, Emily Abenett, on the transition of learners with additional learning needs into FE, because that's another area that we thought could do with some exploration. So yeah, I've got a few projects on the go, and the work with Susan Davis, of course. Yeah, we're still working on that.
And I suppose the intersections between those two areas are quite profound, because I know that your book deals with transition for vulnerable learners too, some of which might be quiet, anxious, shy for numerous reasons. There's a lot of crossover.
Yes, yeah, there is. And I think what comes through quite clearly is that, and is key to it really, is the relationship that practitioners have with their learners and the relationship that the school has with parents. I think those are the key features really for good transition, and equally for supporting vulnerable learners is about maintaining a good partnership between the learner, the parents and the practitioner.
And reassuringly, I think you'll know more about this than me, but the new ALN bill in Wales and ALN code of conduct that we've got coming in, or code of practice, I can't remember, is much more about working with the learner, acknowledging the learner's voice and making sure that they are a key part of the process in their provision and helping them to help themselves.
Yeah, definitely. And it's more about looking at that learner from a more holistic perspective. So not just looking at the academic profile of the learner, but looking at how the learner behaves, how the learner feels supported, what provision can be put in around the learner to enable them to achieve the goals that they want. And yeah, I'm really excited about the codes of practice that's coming in from September this year. But I'm mindful that it will be quite a challenge as well to fulfil what the code of practice states.
Watch this space.
Yeah, it's an exciting time.
It is. Yeah. There's a lot of new, isn't there? But I think there's a lot of new that is all kind of hopefully sort of, as you say, kind of hopefully holistically working together in tandem. Because if we keep going back to those four core purposes, everything that we're doing in terms of ALN speaks to those too. So
yes, yeah.
Yeah. Hopefully it's all going to start to work in tandem. But I think that concludes our deep discussion. Now I'm going to, with trepidation, ask, because it's not been that long since you were on and we were asking you these questions back in January, but dare I ask, have you got something for our listeners to try?
Yes, I have. So as you know, we're recording and it's almost St David's Day. And I'm a Welsh speaker, an avid Welsh lady. So St David's has a famous quote, which is "Gwnewch y pethau bychain mewn bywyd." So it means do the little things in life. And I thought about relating this to practice, and it's about noticing the little things about your pupils. So it's about taking time to build those meaningful relationships with them that I think reap rewards on a number of levels. So if your pupil thinks that you know them well, they're more responsive to you as a teacher and they're more responsive to what you've got to teach them. So yeah, that's my top tip really, or something to try, is to do the little things, to notice the little things.
That's an excellent one, and one to, I think, take into our transition back to face-to-face teaching whenever it comes. Have you got anything interesting to share with our listeners, something that they can go and consume?
Well, I've got two. I'm not following the rules, sorry. I've got two. So
you're allowed. You just had a book published.
One for pure relaxation, and it's absolutely brilliant, is if you've got Netflix, it's The Queen's Gambit, and it's also a book, and I'm currently reading the book and thoroughly enjoying it. So I've watched the series and I'm now reading the book, and usually I should probably have read the book before the series, but actually I'm not disappointed at all. So yeah, I recommend The Queen's Gambit. And secondly is another book that I've been reading, because I've been teaching a module on autism spectrum disorder, and this book is a tome of a book. It's a really good doorstep, but it's an excellent read, and it's called Neurotribes by Steve Silberman. And it's not a heavy book about autism. It's absolutely fascinating about how we understand autism, but also the people who have autism and how it affects their lives. Yeah, fascinating book.
Two cracking recommendations there, Rhiannon. You never disappoint, and I've got to agree with you on the Queen's Gambit front. I'm a big fangirl of that. Really enjoy it. It looked beautiful as well. The whole styling of it, I found just stunning.
Yeah, I was going to say that the clothes and the background is just superb. Yeah. Excellent.
Absolutely. But I'm not going to indulge too much in this conversation because you and I will end up going off on a tangent. So I'm going to keep myself firmly on track. So you know what's coming now. The last one. Have you been trying anything new in terms of well-being, or have you got an old faithful to share in terms of well-being?
Well, on the last podcast, I'd started running because I was a bit worried I wasn't moving at all. So, that I've now progressed. So I think when I first spoke to you, I was stopping and starting a lot. So I'm progressing now. I can run 5K without stopping. So my well-being tip is to keep going. It doesn't matter if you stop, but keep going.
Ardderchog. Excellent, Rhiannon. That is fantastic. And how long did it take you to get to 5K? Did you do a couch to 5K or?
No, I did Rhiannon's version. So I started running around the block and up the hill. And then when I could go up the hill without stopping, I started going a little bit further. So I've just done it bit by bit, really. I have joined Strava, not properly because I can't connect my Fitbit to Strava. But and that's been a really good motivation. I've been doing, I can't remember what it's called, Run Ed. So I did Run Ed Jan and Run Ed Feb. So it's not competitive, but it does give you a little bit of motivation to keep running. So I found that quite helpful.
Oh, wonderful. And I've got to say, our podcast episodes are perfect length for a run. I can't squeeze that in there.
I can't run with anything. I can't run with headphones or anything. I just have to go and run. So.
Wow, that's good. That's hardcore, Rhiannon. To just free thinking. Yeah. Yeah, I find it quite difficult to run without music in my ears or something to divert my thoughts from the pain or the fact that I'm breathing very heavily.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm a reluctant runner because I don't enjoy it, but the thrill when I come back is great. So, yeah.
The runner's high is real.
I don't like running, I'm just going to say, but... I'm gonna absolutely stick to my guns on that. But yeah, thank you, Rhiannon. It's very impressive that you've managed to come back so soon and with another set of short slots for us. But more importantly, that deep discussion, I think, is really timely as we do one of the most uncharted transitions of them all, which is to try and get everybody back into school and back into learning the old way, but hopefully with some new bits as well. So some really important food for thought there for everybody. So thank you for coming back and doing that. Anybody who wants to read your book, can you remind us what it is and who it's published by?
Yes, it's called All Change, Best Practice for Educational Transitions. It's by myself, Catherine Jones, Amanda Thomas and Philippa Watkins, and it's published by Critical Publishing.
Wonderful. Well, I will certainly be purchasing my copy, and I would imagine it's going to be something that our book club will want to read at some point. We're on a book club together, so maybe we'll have that as one of our books down the line. That'd be a little bit cringy for you.
Yeah.
You'll have to recuse yourself from that book club, Rhiannon.
I might be washing my hair for that one.
Well, listen, Dr. Rhiannon Packer, it's been a pleasure as always. Stay safe and well, and I'm sure we'll have you back in the future to talk about one of those many additional research projects that you're working on some point down the line.
Yeah, thank you for making the interview a very pleasant one. I've really enjoyed it.
Oh, we've enjoyed it too. And for those listeners out there, hopefully you've enjoyed it, and we'll be back in your ears usual in 2 weeks' time.
You've been listening to Emma and Tom Talk Teaching, a podcast about all things education, presented by Emma Thayer and Tom Breeze. The special guest this episode was our colleague from Cardiff Met, Dr. Rhiannon Packer, and her book, All Change, Best Practice for Educational Transitions, is published by Critical Publishing. Thanks to Rhiannon for taking part. Podcast artwork is by Beth Blanford, and the music is by Cameron Stewart. We'll be back in a fortnight with something else interesting. Until then, take care and enjoy teaching.